So welcome everybody to our first Mind Growth Masterclass. We're pleased to be hosting one of our favorite Mind Masters, Dr. Ian Weinberg. I met Dr. Weinberg in 2017 at a Buddhist retreat and have been fascinated with his work ever since. So Dr. Weinberg is a neurosurgeon at Linksfield Clinic in Johannesburg, but he has a passion for wellness and performance, and doing that by shifting our mind states from a place of destructive emotions to one of integration and gratification. And that subject is obviously very close to our hearts because David and I lost our son 2 years ago to suicide. So we've actually made it our current passion. So we like to go into organizations and teaching people how to be in a better mind state. And in our current world where we have AI, ESCOM, wars, economic decline, it's very difficult to stay in a positive mind state. So I'm going to hand over to Ian now, and we're going to make this session quite casual. So please ask questions. You can put your questions in the chat box and I'll make sure Ian gets them. And yes, I'm interested into an exciting 40 minutes. Over to you, Ian.
Okay. So this is a massive subject, and in fact, I've been at it for many years. In fact, I've done my 10,000 hours to about the third degree. I think I've done about 30,000 hours on the subject. It's a passion of mine, this thing called consciousness. I am a neuro-based person, I'm a neuroscientist-based person, a neurosurgeon in practice, but my passion has always been consciousness, and specifically regarding cognitive function and emotional function. And latterly, when I say latterly, the last 25 years, in fact, has been the study of the effects of mind states, cognitive and emotional function on body function, physiology, specifically immune system. And this has grown over the years, and the subject of psychoneuroimmunology, or which we call P&I, really has come into its own, and in fact has become almost, I would say, a critical new component in the scientific playing field, which has also become applied in most, if not all, of our spheres of daily life. And so initially I was very much involved in it from a clinical point of view. How do you enhance the immune system while we're busy doing our usual conventional bit, which was either removing the tumors or suppressing the inflammations with surgery or chemotherapy or radiation treatment. But it got many legs and it started growing, and the mind states became refined, and the neurochemistry underpinning the mind states became very, very clear. And the interface of that chemistry underpinning the mind states was shown very clearly to interface with immune chemistry. And this became two-way traffic. In other words, the mind states affected the immune function, and similarly, the immune function through its chemistry and feedback onto the brain influenced the mind states. And so we have a very powerful whole new dimension, which is yet to be fully incorporated in the biomedical model, which is a very mechanistic model, which is the classical conventional medical model. The mind effect on immunity obviously now begging to give rise to the biopsychosocial model, where we are not just fortuitously getting ill, but our mind states are giving rise to many of those illnesses and deciding the outcome of those illnesses. The big thing here, of course, is that when we refer to mind state, we're not just talking about how we're affected by our current environment, but we're also talking about how our mind states were affected by our early nurture history. And so those who were fortunate enough in having well-rounded, comprehensive, supportive nurture histories developed a narrative which was enhancing, life-enhancing, wellness-enhancing, and in fact, in the cognitive space, created a mind state which was able to see the world as it really is. And that's the critical element, because seeing the world as it really is talking about awareness. It's about awareness of the world around us, and it's an awareness of ourselves, self-awareness. And never before has self-awareness become so critical as we are being hit with so many factors which impact so fundamentally on our current life situations. And so, yes, we went into the COVID pandemic totally at the mercy of two things. Number one, conventional medicine, and number two, available information. And that's how we formulate our worldview. Sadly, that information that was fed to us with some other agenda, which was not necessarily in our best interests. And the result was that we formulated a mind state, a subjective worldview, and with it, the emotional appendage, and the emotional side of it is critical in driving the chemistry of the mind-immune connection. And so we know now from the world of neuroscience that initially, when we create a worldview in our earliest nurture years, it is a process that works up from the bottom up. In other words, through our sensory areas, we get information and we slowly formulate our worldview on the incoming information. And so we see a bottom-up type of creation of networks. But as we develop more comprehensive networks, we now start developing our early subjective worldview, and with it comes our biases, or call them beliefs. And in many cases, those are limiting beliefs. And limiting beliefs have this effect of influencing what information comes in through our sensory areas. And so we see the subsequent development of top-down influencing. And top-down influencing is really our biases. We all, to some extent, work on a confirmation bias. Our subjective worldview has given us awareness of our environment, and the top-down effect filters in that which we regard as plausible and filters out that which we regard as foreign. And so we're at the mercy of information now. And if you are an individual who had a degree of deprivation in the nurture environment, you may not see things as they really are, or you may have a very powerful external locus of control, in which case you are very much controlled by the information that's fed to you. And if it appears to be authoritative or authenticated, then that will ultimately be allowed in, and that will become your subjective worldview. The problem here is if there is something erroneous, false, manipulated in that information, well, your subjective worldview is going to be flawed, and you're not going to see the world as it really is. And so you are going to mess up in terms of making decisions. Actions that follow are all going to be subjected then to that somewhat flawed subjective worldview. That's just on the awareness side of things. On the emotional side of things, we now know, and it's all proven, it's validated stuff, that there are certain emotional states which impact very much on the immune system. And one of them is in an area of the brain called the amygdala, never mind these big words, but in the amygdala, which is the seat of fear, anxiety, panic, and rage. And so if you are an individual who is caught up through your awareness of the world through your subjective worldview, if you're now caught up in a state of extreme fear, then you are going to affect your own immune function and many other functions. And we saw that very much in the COVID pandemic situation, because what happens with extreme fear and raised adrenaline and persistently raised adrenaline is that you do suppress your immune function, and you increase something called chronic inflammation. Chronic inflammation, we now know, underpins about 80% of all human severe illnesses. You also would move into a space when you see things that are beyond your control, when you lose your frame of reference, when things don't work out the way you expected them, you move into a space called hopeless helpless. And hopeless helpless may not be that dramatic. It may be just a very subtle mind state, but it produces its poison. And hopeless helpless contributes to the suppression of immunity. And so you'll end up with not only compromised mind states in terms of cognitive function in the form of awareness as well as emotional function, but you compromise your physiological function, specifically your immune function, and lay yourself open to chronic inflammation, which underpins many illnesses and which has been shown to underpin many cancers. It also underpins neurodegenerative conditions such as Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and many other things. Coronary artery disease, all artery disease has an inflammatory component. So we can see, in fact, the picture unraveling where you're not just compromising your cognitive awareness level and moving into a destructive emotional space, but you are starting to compromise yourself in terms of wellness and ultimately also in terms of performance. And we also add on to that leadership. And so this subject, which has a big name, psychoneuroimmunology, which we refer to as PNI, the scientific study of mind states, cognitive and emotional function, on immune function, and on many other physiological functions, has now come into its own, because we now move into, from the global pandemic situation, we now move into a space which is now even more complicated by the development of AI, by the fact that we have emerged from a global pandemic which basically cut us down wherever we were and whatever we were doing, into lockdowns, into social distancing, which really severely compromised our subjective worldview, compromised our terrain, our familiar terrain, our frame of reference was severely compromised and has never really fully recovered. So we move now into post-pandemic. Still, we have a markedly compromised terrain. Our frames of reference have been probably irrevocably changed. There's still an enormous amount of fear. There's still an enormous amount of mis or disinformation. And so we have many people who are completely unhinged. They have lost their footing completely. And now comes the big curved ball of the lot, and that is we have AI replacing whole divisions of companies globally, expected to replace or change the job descriptions of 1 billion people before 2030. That's a lot of people that are going to have to completely reassess through new awareness and recreate themselves. And we're now talking about even reasonably young people who have qualified in certain subjects, have developed experience, are highly experienced and highly respected in those particular fields. For example, such as economic analysis, financial analysis, even actuarial science, all being replaced now by AI. And so whole divisions that were involved with the evaluation of numbers, the evaluation of strategies, are all being replaced, leaving a massive vacuum of many, many unemployed individuals who now have to, and for want of a better word, let's use the coaching word, rebrand. They're going to have to rebrand themselves. But rebranding means, number one, gaining authentic awareness of what's going on around us, then applying that to self-awareness. Who are you really? What do you do? What are your strengths and weaknesses? And how do you go forward from here, knowing that either your job is in jeopardy or you've already lost it, or it's imminently about to be reduced to, let's call it planned obsolescence. And so we need to go into a completely new space. We now need to be aware that there are certain destructive mind states which affect us physiologically. And there's one little caveat that I need to add to this, and that is when there is a an excess amount of fear-producing chemistry, mainly in the form of adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisol. These are the chemicals which compromise our reasoning ability. So we've got a double whammy here, because that feedback coming back from the immune system, the one that's associated with chronic inflammation, the mediators tend to mess with our cognitive function, specifically our reasoning ability. And so we get caught up in a really nasty, vicious circle where the things that we need most in those particular times, not those, these particular times, are compromised by negative chemistry. And yet the negative chemistry is the consequence of that environment. The question is, how does one transcend this particular space? How do we transcend our negative subjectivity in an environment which is predisposing to this subjective negativity, in order to recreate ourselves in the context of a very new environment? It does require one massive move away from an external locus of control to one of an internal locus of control. We need to now take control and say, you know what, I can no longer depend on this environment that I had taken for granted, that had given rise to all that I am, that had supported me in all that I did, and was highly predictable in what I was doing, because now it is not supporting you and it is not predictable, and you are still suffering the post-traumatic stress following a pandemic that took away your frame of reference, and in many cases seriously compromised one's ability to earn a basic living. And so we really have a challenge ahead of us. And what we are saying is that ultimately we need to go back to basics. We need to know what is going on. We need to ensure that we authenticate the information that we are basing our subjective worldview upon, and that we make some very serious decisions as to where we're going to go, both in terms of surviving, but also to enhance our wellness performance, and in many cases, our leadership situation.
Ian, could I come in for 1 second there, just ask you a question? So in terms of young people, you know, we in the material that you've put together, we always talk about purpose and meaning, you know, driven by curiosity. And for me, you know, I'm thinking, you know, what would be the advice for young people today? I certainly think, you know, to get into something where they have a lot of meaning and a lot of purpose. What are your thoughts around that?
Well, we have some serious challenges with that cross-section of the community, because they're the technological individuals. They were brought up now with the technology. They are in a technological environment. They're in a cyberspace environment. In many cases, they've lost contact with the natural world. They have, in many cases, been severely compromised in interacting with peers and colleagues and families. And so they have even more disadvantages. And my advice to these individuals, obviously, don't give up on your technological understanding and advancement, but it's time to get back to basics. It's time to go back into nature. It's time to interact with people in a living world, because at the end of the day, we've realized after the pandemic, we are not islands. We are not creatures that can live in isolation. Even if that isolation was enhanced with technological connections, such as the one that we're using right now, it's not enough. It's great for adding or supplementing what we're doing, but it's time to get back to the real natural world where there are people, to interacting with people. And that's where it's going to start. And then on that foundation, slowly integrate it then with the technology. In other words, make the technology more authentic.
And I think, you know, you always talk about our biological heritage, and, you know, the way we were back in, you know, when we were hunter-gatherers. And I think, you know, that's always struck me in your discussions that you've had with us around, you know, we were living in groups and we had the nurture situation. And human beings in the Western world, we've almost moved right away from that, you know, and that's always had a sort of profound kind of impact on me.
Absolutely. I think that, I mean, this is the advice I give my own patients. And in fact, of all ages, I say, look, the biggest danger now is we have never been so close as a species, and this is profoundly important. We have never been so close to an existential crisis. We're actually beginning to ask the question, what is this all about? What is human life all about? This is how much we have now fallen to ground zero. We're now at ground zero. What is this all about? And here is where we really need to embark on the self-awareness situation, and this awareness on a greater scale. Read more of the classics, listening to music of the classics. Let's reconnect with all that we've achieved as a species up until this point, because otherwise we're in danger of losing it. I mean, they basically asked this question to the powers that be, and the powers that be, let's call it, at this point in time, there's many of them, but sitting at the top is the World Economic Forum. And so they want this whole story about global domination and controlling of the economies globally, and going into a global cryptocurrency and cash disappears and the whole story. And they want to control everything from the top. And the result is, obviously, they're going to incorporate AI into this whole story. And the question was then asked of Harari, who is, in fact, the author of those two books, which I found, in many cases, very nauseating. But apart from that, he is the senior advisor to Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum. And they put the question to them, this world that we're talking about, emerging from the pandemic, with AI coming in, we're going to have this enormous amount of redundancy of humanity, obsolete humanity. What is your advice for this gross, obsolete humanity? And the response was, give them more computer games and more drugs. That is, in fact, the view that the leaders of the economies have of the masses.
Yeah.
And if you expect it to be saved, supported, or in any way sustained by that external terrain, by that external frame of reference that we had up until the pandemic, that's the kind of feeling they have towards you.
So we're almost on a train. This train is going down the railway tracks at a very high speed towards irrelevance. You know, it's almost like, you know, where is our relevance in the world now? It's quite scary.
Well, I mean, it's basically, it's saying, you know what, your relevance is what you're going to make of it.
Yeah.
I'm afraid that depending on them, the powers out there, they're not going to give you your relevance. You're going to have to create your own relevance in a new world, in a space that you're familiar with, a space that you enjoy. Gratification is a critical element of recreating yourself to ensure that you have sufficient gratification in what you're doing. I mean, in a survey done a couple of years before the pandemic in the US, where they questioned corporate USA, and they found that only 20% of corporate USA derive some gratification from their work environment. Almost 80% were preoccupied with 80% of their awake time in doing something purely for the paycheck. And that is not a sustainable situation. That's not a sustainable situation. I've just now read, every year in the medical profession, we get a printout from the US in the literature of the job satisfaction of our colleagues. Only 45% of our colleagues in the USA in the medical profession are deriving gratification in what they're doing. We are looking at, in one particular group, I'll keep them confidential, one particular specialist group, the burnout, the documented burnout level is 76%. So these are the people who are mediating healthcare. And even in the healthcare environment, there's not much healthcare going on. They are basically just keeping themselves afloat. So we really are in trouble. And I think that at the end of the day, yes, we need to look at, and as you know, my model is the triangles model, which is being used in the clinical, the corporate, and personal environments. We'd have to look at the lessons because it's been built specifically to answer these challenges. And you and Sarah are obviously accredited coaches carrying it out and doing your bit that you do best, and using our diagnostic that we can measure these levels of hopeless, helplessness, and how close individuals are to this existential crisis, and then bringing in the appropriate intervention. So yes, people such as yourself in crossing through the personal into the corporate environment are critical now in bringing the message to the masses to help them, in fact, to help themselves, to quote a cliche, because they are ultimately going to have to help themselves. You can no longer depend on those people or that individual or that group or that system to take care of you.
Ian, could you could you do us a favor? Could you just talk a little bit around building neuroplasticity and the 5 principles that come out of your research? I think it's really interesting in terms of meaning and purpose and curiosity and all of those things. Could you touch on that in terms of building new neural connections?
Okay, sure. So basically, this was our research over many years, as well as the research done in the literature, all put together what we call the 5 core elements. And the 5 core elements are mind states or processes that give rise to the best of creating new networks, neuronal networks. And I think that we need to just define this concept called neuroplasticity. So neuroplasticity is the process whereby we create new connections between neuronal representative areas of the brain based on our experience, our observations, our perceptions. And we break down connections which are no longer being used or have become redundant. Obviously, you can already see if there's a problem with building, you're not having enough simulation to build new processes, but you're breaking down redundant, you're running on a negative. You're basically going to start losing brain tissue, which is in fact my contribution to the whole subject of Alzheimer's. In fact, you're running on a negative for too long, that you lose the critical mass of amount of operating neuronal cells in vital areas of the brain. So the 5 core elements were identified as being mind states or processes which gave rise to the optimal level of neuroplasticity. The first is meaning and purpose and the curiosity to engage. The second one is self-esteem, self-efficacy. The third is gratification or reward in engaging or in mastering. And the third is achievement. In other words, we've defined that as being achieving more than you expected or anticipated achievement. And finally, a very, very big one, value contribution. Value contribution to yourself, value contribution to your immediate environment, to your extended environment. And that is closely related to connectivity. In other words, you couldn't really see what value to create unless you were connected with the substrate that you were going to contribute to. And so those are the five core elements that together, and they all have to be there. You can't just have one or the other. Before the pandemic and in the traditional coaching environment, we used to coach the first 4. Well, the first 4, that meaning and purpose and the drive and the self-efficacy, self-esteem and the gratification from doing what you're doing and the achievement, we used to push that. That was like called unleashing the best that you are. Well, we created really successful sociopaths or psychopaths because without the value contribution component, that's all you're going to get. But we'd like to believe that post-pandemic, in this new environment, the phoenix rising out of the ashes of the pandemic must include a value contribution component. The opposite.
Sorry, Ian, carry on, go.
the opposite to the 5 core elements. So we can say the 5 core elements were in the green zone, the productive zone, the zone that enhanced your wellness, performance, and leadership. But the opposite pole to this was the individual who was lost in hopeless helplessness, didn't see the point in even trying because they didn't see any gratification in what they were doing. And that then led to the worst of all, which would be a space of perceived irrelevance. If you ever perceive yourself as being irrelevant in terms of who you are, irrelevant in terms of what you're saying, irrelevant in terms of how you occupy most of your day, well, then you're just setting yourself up for a demise, which will happen sooner than later.
I see we have a question here from Dion. I'm just going to read it quickly. Dion is saying, throughout humanity, work has really been something enjoyable, a means to an end. It's only recently that we've become more aware of work that can be enjoyable. So could it not be argued that we're in the best place we've ever been as humans? Did you get that?
Well, we've got the most opportunities, but at the end of the day is how you approach them. So assuming you're not going to be negatively affected by this mass retrenchment globally, and you're still going to be retaining your job, well, it all depends on how you approach your job. Well, we would actually argue that if you didn't enjoy what you were doing and you only did it for your paycheck, you're not really enhancing your quality of life.
No.
So yes, we've seen the least poverty in the history of mankind, but probably we're seeing the most dissatisfaction with one's lot. You could call it almost, I imagine in the tone of the question that was asked, you could probably talk about lack of gratitude with what you're doing. Well, it depends on how you look at this. I mean, if you see the job as a means to an end, and that's all the job was meant to be, personally, I think that undermines our humanity.
Yeah.
And that you ought to either change your approach to that particular work to make it more gratifying, more meaningful, and to create a much bigger reserve between yourself and that space of irrelevance, or you need to look for another job, or you need to rebrand yourself completely.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, you know, in your book that you wrote, Consciousness, and you talk about the corporates, and you know, coming from a corporate environment myself, you know, you're trying to appease the shareholders almost at the expense of your own happiness and enjoyment and gratification. It becomes this whole corporate game just becomes this game of how much money can we make every month, and human beings are almost expendable in my experience, certainly, and maybe my experience is slightly jaded, but it's always been something I've thought about, you know.
Yeah, I think that's where we are. I think that we really are at the crossroads. I mean, we've arrived at a certain level of our evolution. Now we can either continue to evolve, and to continue to evolve means to now consolidate everything that we've spoken about for the better of our quality of life, longevity, and the value that we create for ourselves and those around us, or we throw in the towel. Because in fact, if we're going to follow this almost zombification of mankind that the World Economic Forum would like us to follow, you know, own nothing and be happy, and for the redundant people, give them more computer games and more drugs. Basically, we're at a point now where we are at the crossroads. I'm sure many generations before us thought that they were at the crossroads, but we've now reached a point where we are global, we are connected, we're all in step, we're all sharing the same things at the same time. This is one big global mind at the moment. And now we know we have choices, but these choices are very, very far reaching because we're a global community. And we can decide, are we going to continue the evolutionary process by pulling out all the best of ourselves and the best of what we've developed? Or are we in fact going to cut ourselves off at the knees? Because we have the potential, we have the technological potential and the globalization of that potential to literally end it here and now. Yeah. We can end it here.
Absolutely. And Ian, can you share with the audience my favorite subject, the power of oxytocin. I mean, obviously the three chemicals, but just maybe dive into how important oxytocin is in terms of our heritage and our awe and all of that stuff, because I think it would really fascinate them.
Well, they used to think that, and it still is, they used to think that the most powerful human mind state was purpose. But there's one thing stronger than purpose, and that's belief. Belief is probably the strongest human emotion. And it just so happens that belief is associated with the secretion of oxytocin. And oxytocin is almost when we look at its physiological functions, is almost the universal antidote to most of the mind state and physiological ills that are the consequence of extreme deprivation. So we now know that extreme deprivation gives rise later on in life to a predisposition to inflammation, chronic inflammation, and with all the subsequent illnesses that follow, anxiety and all the things that go with it. We now know that oxytocin suppresses the part of the brain that's involved with fear, anxiety, panic, and rage. So it suppresses the amygdala. It enhances our area of gratification. It suppresses cortisol, which is one of the stress drugs. And it generally suppresses the background chemistry that gives rise to chronic illness, essentially. That's what it does. And what stimulates it is obviously the mind state of belief, anxiety. Sorry, suddenly just lost my footing there. Belief is the top one. And trust, belief, and awe are the critical components that are associated and stimulate oxytocin production. But oxytocin production is also secreted by gastrointestinal function, digestion, maternal pregnancy, giving rise to the child, breastfeeding. Massage gives rise to increased oxytocin production. And some people say meditation, that's still got to be proven. So there's a lot of very important daily activities and life situations which give rise to the mind state, empathy, trust, belief, and awe. Empathy, by the way, was critical. Empathy, trust was critical for us to start procreating. If we didn't develop the mindset of empathy and trust and belief, we would never have been able to start procreating and nurturing, because the most useless offspring are human offspring. They are totally useless. You can't see much potential in a newborn human. You see lots of potential in animals, but very little in the human animal.
No,
and
yeah.
In fact, you couldn't nurture such a being unless you had a lot of oxytocin, which
and
is
a lot of
empathy, trust,
patience.
And in fact, that's one of the things that I propose. That's why human beings have the greatest self-awareness or potential to self-awareness, is because we started off with so little that we had to become aware of each step of the way. It was an intense situation, whereas most animals are born with most functions inborn already.
Yeah.
So hence our self-awareness, we had to develop the long and the hard way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Barry, I see your hands up there. Barry Walker, you got a question there?
Yes, I do. Thank you. And I just wanted to find out, you mentioned at the beginning, you were speaking about the amygdala. So from my understanding, the amygdala is basically your autopilot or your auto response, that my previous understanding. So it's basically how your brain is programmed to respond without even consciousness. So it's like your subconscious automatic response to any given situation. Now, that is obviously then formed through what you mentioned in terms of your information that comes through, and that creates your subjective worldview. So that subjective worldview and your interpretation of the information that you've received would then drive the activity and response of the amygdala. If I'm correct in saying that, then my actual question is, how do we, if you are in that destructive emotional state through everything that causes that, how do you reprogram your amygdala when it is something that isn't consciously programmed?
So the amygdala is the seat of fear, anxiety, panic, and rage. It is the fight or flight space. It is not the coordinator of the whole brain. It is involved with the response to things which might affect you. And for that reason, there are very short fibers going straight to it and back again, where there's no mediation coming in from the higher centers of the brain, namely the prefrontal cortex and from the hippocampus, which is the place of memory and contextual memory and using memory. So the hippocampus, the amygdala can function completely automatically to challenges. Now, it is at the mercy of the sensory information. Here's a classical example. I mean, it's not very accurate on the reading of the actual nature of the stimulus. It merely, if it at its lower level perceives danger, it will automatically and instantaneously react. So, for example, the classic example we've always used is you're walking in the veld and suddenly you see this thing that looks like a snake and you go into fight, flight, usually flight or freeze mode. It's fight, flight, or freeze. And then you look again and it's a host bite. And now what's happened is your prefrontal cortex and your hippocampus now bring in the information and they quieten down the amygdala. If the amygdala was not quietened down, you would get caught, you'd be locked in your amygdala. Now, that is something which I noted and included in our literature a couple of years ago. And it came just fortuitously. And what this meant is the amygdala manifests its action, fight, flight, or freeze, by secreting adrenaline, noradrenaline, or cortisol. But it is those exact same chemicals which stimulate the amygdala. So you can actually get completely locked into your amygdala. So you can be locked into a state of fear. Add to that the adrenaline, which totally suppresses your prefrontal cortex. And now all that your brain is chemically, there's an amygdala on each side, a left and a right. All you are two raging red hot amygdala.
Now that's exactly
no real thinking.
What I was asking.
That's your road rage, by the way. That's your road rage.
That's exactly what the way you summed that up is exactly what I was actually asking, if it's in a very layman terms. So my question is then, how, if you're in that, because of course, when you're feeling confident and when you've had a good run, your anxiety, so being in a perceived business environment, stressful situation, that isn't as easily triggered as when you are highly anxious or stressed out, then of course anything triggers that fight or flight. So my question again then is, how do you reprogram that when you are caught and stuck in it and it is one just big, how do you get out?
So it's a very interesting question, because what happened was literally 2019, just before the pandemic, I did 2 back-to-back workshops in Bali. And it's a great environment, and it's sort of a hedonist's paradise. But I gave these 2 workshops, my 2 standard workshops, to them, and amongst those who attended the workshops were very accomplished yogis. And we then had this exact same discussion, and their response to a raging amygdala was distraction. Distract yourself away from the thing which triggered it in the first place. And they maintained that you never, ever needed to engage with the cause of the trigger. You just needed to maintain the distraction. However, the opposing side, which is mine, so in the intervention that uses my program, we've got what's called the 3-to-1 ratio. So the 3-to-1 ratio is the foundation for our intervention. So the 3 areas of the brain, which are known physiologically and psychologically to suppress the amygdala, are well known, very well known. If someone is absolutely caught up in a panic type situation, or a rage situation, the first thing you have to do is you have to create a break state. You've got to stop that state, even if it's just temporarily. You've got to stop that state because otherwise they're locked in. They're producing the chemistry which is stimulating it, so they're locked in. So you need a break state. So then you'll have your distraction or another person's just hang on there, just look into my eyes and breathe with me, just breathe with me. You just need about 2 or 3 minutes of distraction and you'll quieten the chemistry down. If you quieten the chemistry down, then that locked in situation will diffuse. And although there'll still be a lot of amygdala going, it will be workable. Now you bring it. Sorry.
And on a macro level, because that helps in the situation.
We're still at the micro. We're still at the micro. So we have calmed down the amygdala with a break state. Now we look at the 3. I said there were 3 areas. The first one is the prefrontal cortex. That's the reasoning center. We now start a reasoning process. We start engaging with the cause that triggered that amygdala. Is it justified? Is it justified to be so fearful or so angry or so whatever it resulted in? So we go through we've got a whole menu that we go through. We go through a disputation process. In other words, we dispute the things that you may believe were justified causes for such an overt amygdala reaction. In other words, you may have overreacted. That's the first thing. So we go through a whole process, and there's a whole menu in our program. There's a whole menu of reasoning, disputation. Then we go into the second area of the brain, which suppresses amygdala, a raging amygdala, which is personal gratification, reward, satisfaction, curiosity, achievement. There's a whole center that's associated with the chemistry of dopamine, and without going into technical terms, that's the second center. The third center is the production of oxytocin, because if you can actually then get someone to experience a degree of empathy outside of themselves, see something outside of themselves, connect with outside of themselves, it's empathy, belief, trust, and awe, something awesome. I'll give an example using that particular case. So in one of the armies of the world, and I know them well, these armies of the world, I was a military neurosurgeon. So I had to embark with many aspects of the healthcare in a troop situation. And so I interacted with military guys around the world. And one of the things which intrigued me the most was the guys who manifest severe post-traumatic reactions in the field. I'm talking about guys who actually go fight, flight, or freeze under fire and remain in a very sort of post-traumatic mind state when the interaction is over. What they did with these guys, and they're pretty useless. They're no longer soldiers. In fact, you have to remove their weapons from them. They are no longer able to function. And what they did with these guys is they took them out of the field, put white coats on them, and then brought them into the hospitals to look after the badly wounded. It was a profound thing because it caused massive outpouring of oxytocin, which went a long way to suppressing their amygdala overreaction. So that was just on a chemical, psychological basis. So what I'm trying to say to you here is there are levels. This is all at the micro level. At the macro level, obviously, we want to create environments that are conducive to supporting the 5 core elements in individuals and in teams. And in fact, we would say reward of teams rather than of individuals, because the rewarding of individuals caused a monstrous type of person in the old dispensation. It was a very self-driven individual, self-enrichment, often at the expense of others. We don't think that that's conducive to an environment that's in fact an exclusive environment as opposed to an inclusive environment. And so if we had an environment and say an organization that subscribed to inclusivity, to the enhancement of the 5 core elements of the individuals, that would invariably roll out into group dynamics, essentially. And you'd be rewarding work units.
And just to add to what Ian's saying there, Barry, because I know we've had a discussion in terms of like having fear. So we usually have this scenario where we are fearful of the future, right? But very often the future doesn't play out the way that we fear it. And it's that whole process of taking things one little step at a time. It's certainly something I've learned from Ian through doing the program, etc., is, I've learned to kind of really pull back on the fear element, because things generally do turn out okay. And we spend so much time fearing that it's not going to be okay. And it's kind of like this complete waste of time. But it's quite a hard concept to like get into our heads, because we naturally have this fear depending on our archetype. So it's not that easy, but it's doable, really is.
It's a genetic to an extent, well, not genetic, but taught behavior, because I grew up in a house where you were always criticized for failures and you were dead scared of failure. And so almost every time you had an initiative or an idea, it was the risks. It's always the risk focused. Everything was risk and failure focused. What if you fail? Does that play a part? And is that something that you can unteach yourself to start looking at what could potentially be the positives instead of always being so scared of failure?
I'm going to let Ian answer that. Absolutely. I think that you need to know that there are several levels of influence. The first influence actually is when you're still in your mother's womb. So in fact, the way the mother reacts to her environment, if there's too much stress, she produces too much of the stress hormones, and the stress hormones cross the placenta, go into the fetal circulation, and end up influencing your own fetal brain development. So you might then be born as a fearful individual. So that's the first line of manipulation. The second line is obviously the early nurture environment. Fearful parents, restrictions, or negative individuals, or individuals in terms of our archetypes who are more towards the Bravo Charlie type, who are fearful individuals who would only see the downside of everything. That's your next level of influence, of negative influence. And then you actually go out into the big bad world, and what you end up doing is you end up carrying a bias in your narrative where you are yourself a fearful person, very low on risk-taking, and through the confirmation bias, you will enhance all the way. You'll enhance the fact that your bias is life-saving, because in fact, you know nothing else. And so that becomes your predominant narrative. And is it changeable? Absolutely. That's why we're here, to say, in fact, no, it is absolutely unlearnable. We can unlearn all that and create new circuitry, hence the concept of neuroplasticity. Once we show you that through disputation, that your belief system, your limiting belief system is unjustified in a bigger environment, that's the beginning of new learning, obviously. And that's how you transcend your narrative. Just to end with one other thing, and that is, we now know that the mediators of inflammation, this is hard chemistry, the inflammatory mediators actually affect your DNA and the production of chemistry in your body, the production of proteins. And this is called epigenetics. It doesn't change the order of your DNA, but it changes which part of your DNA is expressed and which is suppressed. And because it is an epigenetic phenomenon, and you are of child-producing, rearing age, you will carry that into your kids. And so we now know, going back, say, to the extreme, which was the Holocaust survivors, there was a particular syndrome amongst the children of Holocaust survivors, and that was always regarded as being pure nurture-based. The Holocaust survivor, extremely fearful of risk, and imparted that to the children, who became a specific syndrome, extremely fearful people. Today, we now know that it's not only that nurture, it is in fact the epigenetics which they've inherited from their parents, that actually has a major part to play on their physiology. So that's my story.
Ian, yeah, just from all of us, thank you so much for the insight. It's always fascinating listening to you, and on this really, I mean, you know how fascinated Sarah and I are, because we do it all the time. But to all of you, thank you so much. We will be having another masterclass with Ian pretty soon. So thank you for all attending, and yeah, have a great week going forward, and we look forward to speaking again. So Ian, thank you so much.